I'd like to welcome you all to this afternoon session. I'd also like to welcome those of us who are joining us in the ether or from the ether. And because this session is online as well as in person, when there's time for you to ask questions or to make interventions, please wait until the microphone of speech reaches you. Otherwise, you won't be heard. I'm David Feldman. I'm the director of the Birkbeck Institute for the Study of Antisemitism, which is one of the organizations which is contributing to the organization, to the planning of this international workshop, and it's my pleasure and honor to chair this session on reflections from and on the field. We have 4 speakers. We'll have a conversation around the table initially before opening it up further. I'm going to make the introductions extremely brief, partly because I want to start off, because it is a set of reflections from the field. I actually want to invite the speakers to introduce themselves, as it were, and say something about their own engagement with the topic of our discussion. Our first speaker will be Seth Anziska, who is Associate Professor of Jewish-Muslim Relations at University College London. Our second speaker will be Saba-Nur Cheema, who is a political scientist and was formerly head of education at the Education Center of the Anne Frank Education Center Anne Frank in Frankfurt. She will be followed by Moshe Zimmermann, who's a historian and a former director of the Kerbner Center for German History at the Hebrew University here in Jerusalem. And lastly, we will hear from Michal Cotler-Wunsh, who is a former MK and a senior strategy and policy advisor. Seth, can we start with you?
Sure. Well, thank you, David, for the introduction. You said right before we started, maybe you should say something about where your head is at, as much as you might say a little bit about what you do in the field. And it made me think a little bit about what is the field. I teach and I work in London at UCL, but I also work on Israel and Palestine and Middle Eastern history. So in some sense, this is the field, partially as well. And so I'm noting that to talk about this subject and to talk about it here is actually quite weighted for me personally. And also to come here and on the day after an ultranationalist flag march, which I want to talk about in the course of this discussion, which I think has a lot to do with the topic we're talking about here as well, is in its own way, I think, part of the question of the field. And in my day job, I teach Middle Eastern history, Jewish-Arab relations, and Israeli and Palestinian society and culture. And I don't work on the history of anti-Semitism. This was not my research topic. And I came to this rather reluctantly and unexpectedly in February in 2019 when an exhibit went up in the central gallery of my university called Moving Objects, Stories of Displacement, that was curated by several colleagues at UCL, and it was looking at the relationship between objects, humans, and what it means to be displaced. And there were several different vitrines in the gallery looking at different experiences of displacement. One of the vitrines was containing material from Palestinian refugee camps in Beirut and in Tripoli, the Badawi camp, and in Jerash and Zarqa in Jordan, excuse me. And in one of those vitrines, there was an object on display that included a traditional Tatriz map of Palestine from the home of a displaced refugee, which had a Palestinian flag on it and didn't make reference to Israel. When that exhibit went up, the curators received an email from a student at UCL who was deeply unhappy and framed a complaint to my university's Equality, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee as a complaint about hidden anti-Semitism in the exhibition, and I was asked to help investigate this exhibit. And so in that sense, my involvement or my engagement with these questions came from that experience and led to a long process of chairing a working group about racism and prejudice and about questions of these definitions of anti-Semitism, which were at the same time being introduced in the UK and also mandated by the UK government as having to be adopted by UK institutions, including my own. And so that's the background. I might also just say at the same time, the final word is that I was involved as well here through the Van Leer Institute in the work that went into the creation of the Jerusalem Declaration on anti-Semitism.
Thank you, Seth. Saba-Nur.
Thank you, David. So, as you just mentioned, I was head of the education of the Education Center Anne Frank in Frankfurt, and I've been responsible for the programs on Islamophobia and anti-Semitism and how to deal with both of these things together, working with school groups, also teachers, and actually everyone, whoever actually came to this education center. So I've been working on that, researching and creating new concepts on how actually to tackle these issues, how to deal with anti-Semitism. And because you asked what's going on right now in our heads, I'll be brief now. I was actually thinking about this topic we just raised in some discussions already, the distinction between anti-Semitism and racism. How important is that? And if we talk about we should differentiate and we should make this distinction, to me it's important to ask who actually. Is it a debate in the academia or is it a debate in the educational context? Because they're there. Even if I would say there are many differences we have to acknowledge and to discuss, but talking about education, it doesn't matter actually. It depends with whom you're working with and how important it is to talk about the different phenomena, where the exact distinction is. So this is one of the issues I've been dealing with for a long time. Also the topic of Jewish-Muslim relations, specifically in Germany. How does that work in practice? There are a lot of different projects which sound so good, interreligious dialogues. Rabbis and imam go together for a ride, or they cook together, so it all sounds so nice, and yes, it's working well. But as soon as there is a new escalation in Israel-Palestine here, you see the rise in the statistics. We talked about statistics as well, a rise in anti-Semitic incidents, and also with a lot of people who have Muslim migrant backgrounds. So what I'm working also on is how to actually create a dialogue between Jews and Muslims in Germany. How important is it? And actually to discuss the issue, which is the issue of Israel and Palestine. Of course, it's not important in Germany itself. There is no solution in Germany. I don't know if there's a solution here, but especially there, it shouldn't be the context of the debate, or it shouldn't be the topic how to solve the issue. But it is something which actually is the most influential topic, or the thing in the relations there, and it creates a lot of not only animosity but also a lot of violence, as we can see in the last few years. So these are the two topics which might be important for our discussion today also. Yeah.
Thank you. Moshe.
Well, anti-Semitism is more or less my second name. I am well acquainted, especially with the guy who invented the concept called anti-Semitism. So I believe that I know what the intent was behind inventing this notion of anti-Semitism. And this is why I can follow the discussion about what anti-Semitism has become over the years. It is anti-Semitism as a word was invented, or more or less introduced, about 140 years ago, that's all. And since then, we are discussing the question what anti-Semitism really is and against whom is anti-Semitism directed. And this brings me, of course, into the real field, because one has to explain. I am a kind of a go-between between Germany and Israel to explain to Germans what anti-Semitism is and how far they are on the way to anti-Semitism, or on the other hand, explaining Israelis what about the fate of anti-Semitism, about the role of anti-Semitism in Germany. It is a discussion that is going on, especially now, because Germany has become a land in which the word anti-Semitism is strong enough to cause a whole lot of, not only of debate, but also a whole lot of harm. It was already mentioned here that 3 years ago, the German parliament, the Bundestag, decided that the worst enemy of the Jews is the BDS, and this is a nice way to exculpate the German right, who is actually the more important element of distributing anti-Semitism. So this ongoing debate in Germany, in Israel, between Germany and Israel, is my field of concern concerning anti-Semitism.
Thank you, Moshe. Michal.
Thank you, and thank you to the organizers for creating this opportunity for an important discussion. I'm here and I look at the title, Defining Anti-Semitism Between History and Politics. I actually haven't heard that much discussion of the history of anti-Semitism, so perhaps this session will talk a little more about anti-Semitism itself and the history of it. Although it was named as such only 140 years ago, I think it existed before those 140 years. So we can perhaps jump a little bit into that in this panel, but also, of course, as politics. And, you know, I come at this, I think, under three hats. One, as a former legislator in Israel's Knesset, as was mentioned by David, and perhaps future legislator. One, as a lawyer who actually very, very critically believes in equal and consistent application of the law and the importance of that if we are to uphold the purpose of whatever it is, whatever regulation or law we hope will apply equally and consistently. And the third, as somebody, and you know, I'm not an academic, as many of the people here are professionally, but I am actually a doctoral researcher of the issue of freedom of speech, or the regulation of freedom of speech on university campuses. And I would say how that has affected free speech, in fact, over the last decade or so. Certainly in North America, the attempted regulation, and those of you that are familiar with the field of speech codes, microaggressions, trigger warnings, safe spaces, and so on, and what are the ramifications on free speech that the intentions were to ensure. And I'll touch a little bit about the political piece, because I do think that there may be some things that are relevant to our discussion here. Among the issues that arose as a legislator in Israel's Knesset, and the role of Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people, assuming you accept the legitimacy of no state to exist, then of course Israel too doesn't have that right, except that I would argue, perhaps, just to follow up on your presentation, that then all states should be tackled equally and consistently for their lack of right to exist. So assuming that you do accept the right of the state of Israel to exist as the nation state of the Jewish people, to which an indigenous people returned after millennia of exile and persecution, and assuming that it is in fact the nation state of the Jewish diaspora, whether you're living here or not, then it has the role, and of course, according to the Declaration of Independence, no less committed to equality to all individuals living in it, assuming you accept the Declaration of Independence, of course, which Ben-Gurion was a signatory of course, and the writer of, then I would say that what we see now is the manifestation, which we've spoken little about, of anti-Semitism in the form of, and we can call it anti-Zionism or just anti-Israel rhetoric throughout the world. And I think that North Americans experience it daily on campuses and on streets whenever something happens in Israel as Jews, whether they're Zionists, self-defining Zionists or not, is something that we do have to tend to. And as I said, as a legislator, having initiated and formed an interparliamentary bipartisan task force to combat specifically online anti-Semitism right at the beginning of COVID. Some of you may be familiar with a huge online campaign that was called actually COVID-48. 48, of course, being the year that the State of Israel the modern State of Israel was founded. That led to several discussions about the lack of ability to tackle online anti-Semitism when there is no definition, not a legally binding definition, but actually a resource such as the IRA working definition or the JDA, and an interparliamentary discussion of that. And I would say one more piece that brings me to this discussion, and that is, as a first-time liaison, Israel's Knesset to the issue of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, with the assumption that the appropriation and weaponization of international law and its institutions to turn Israel into a pariah state, so where classical anti-Semitism over time would have barred the individual Jew from having an equal place within society, then if indeed the weaponization of international law, its institutions and human rights have enabled the mutation of anti-Semitism, it targets in many ways modern anti-Semitism, to bar the Jewish nation state from an equal place among the nations. And so the role of weaponization actually concerned me from the place of high regard for human rights and the rules-based order, which we are all committed to uphold, promote, and protect, and of course the undermining of that rules-based order, which we see as we speak, whether with regards to China and the Uyghurs, whether with regard to Iran and its genocidal regime, whether with regards to Russia and Ukraine, and I think should trouble all those that believe that that rules-based order post-World War II is meant to uphold, promote, and protect foundational principles. So I hope we'll be able to get into that. Thanks.
Thank you, Michal. There's a lot there from all of our speakers, which I'm sure we shall come back to. But before turning to such high-minded concerns, I'll simply add something which I ought to have mentioned at the start, which is to say that to those people who are joining us online, that if you do have comments or questions, they will be conveyed to me through my mobile phone, and I will try to do my best to sort of balance interventions from people online and people who are here with us in the room. But back to the discussion, and I think maybe one way of approaching some of the issues which Michal and others just raised is to ask the question of our speakers from their individual standpoints of what they see the sort of current state of anti-Semitism and indeed the current state of anti-Semitism to be. I mean, in the case of the former, that's often framed in terms of, is it getting better? Is it getting worse? And the issue of around anti-Semitism, it seems to me the question there, and indeed the question which underpins why we're all here in this room and online at present, is why is anti-Semitism so controversial now? Seth, would you like to get us going on that?
Well, I think the question is context dependent, is the first thing to say, which is we can't give a uniform answer given that we're all coming from different places, and I think the story in each of these contexts is perhaps animated by its own particularities. I can speak from the context of what I've seen in the UK and what I know of the US, which is an instance of what we saw within our own institution and more broadly across British society, is that you have always had, and there remains, incidents and realities of anti-Semitism. They come from many different directions, and David, you've been a great guide in this regard, and that the debates over definitions or the debates over whether anti-Semitism is increasing or not have, in some sense, been happening apart from the actual dealing with realities of anti-Semitism on the ground, that there's a lot of political conjuncture to think about. For example, the realities that have happened in the Labour Party and the debates over Jeremy Corbyn have taken a lot of focus in a way around the broader question of the politics of anti-Semitism rather than necessarily incidents themselves. In our own institution, we found through social science researchers and surveys that yes, there were certainly clear examples of anti-Semitism that didn't cohere or didn't actually really match with the issues around Israel-Palestine. They tended to come from either classical tropes or a kind of Anglican British social class-based anti-Semitism, and students feeling uncomfortable, students feeling that comments were made to them about Jews, about Sabbath, and whether they could delay their exams, comments that were insensitive or lacked an understanding of Jewish culture and Jewish history, and that were also, as one researcher said, had nothing to do explicitly with conversations about Israel-Palestine, but was old poison in new bottles, that they were reframed in different ways, students afraid of disclosing they were Jewish because of being called names, having to listen to jokes about Nazis and other anti-Semitic tropes about rich Jews, etc. What kind of concerned me in the response is that the institution, and I think you see this at many institutions, wasn't actually dealing with those instances or how to navigate those instances of anti-Semitism, which would require a certain educational program, a certain way of understanding why those tropes exist in wider British society, but rather was using the politics of definitions or off-the-shelf definitions as a kind of tick box exercises. And anybody who's spent time in the UK knows that we love our tick box exercises, but they become performative and they don't actually address some of the systemic root causes of anti-Semitism and how it manifests or the ways in which it's changing. And I think that's one other thing to add here is that it's as a phenomenon, it's always changed and shifted throughout history. So what it means now is not what it meant in 1970. It's not what it meant in 1925. And the ahistoricity by which, in a UK institutional context, a kind of off-the-shelf definition was institutionalized and was demanded as a kind of a response or a solution to the problem of anti-Semitism, spoke to me of a kind of deep ignorance about the way in which anti-Semitism actually exists and how it functions.
Thank you, Seth. Saba-Nur.
Should I?
Yeah.
So you talked about the British context. We actually discussed the German context already, the German discourse, and Esra actually made a presentation exactly on that. So maybe some aspects which we could deepen it a little bit is the rise of the numbers on in the statistics. We discussed them also, the anti-Semitic incidents. If you compare the numbers from 2005 and 2021, then there is a giant rise. But at the same time, and this is the other side of that coin, maybe you could say, the increase in the statistics is also because there is a way more attention to anti-Semitism in general, in public sphere and in the political sphere. And this is related to other happenings, which is, for example, the adoption of the IRA definition in 2016 in Germany. And also before there was the publication of the report of the independent experts on anti-Semitism, and they had a number of recommendations what should be done in Germany. So we have the commissioner on the fight against anti-Semitism, Felix Klein, who is known, I think, not only in Germany, but for his different points of views on some international debates. So, and the monitoring and the reporting on anti-Semitism has been widened so much in the field, and there are so many NGOs who have started to monitor anti-Semitic incidents because they are not they're not satisfied with the government how the government statistics are made up, which are, and this is actually just the maybe adding to the discussion yesterday, because we were discussing if the 90% right-wing anti-Semitic, because the numbers we have It is said that 90% are from the right wing and the rest are maybe religiously motivated or others. But of course, you don't know about who is actually meant with the 90%. It's not said that they are right wing, because the statistic is made not according to what's the background of the person who actually was doing the whatever he did. So it's not about who is mentioned like in the statistic, but it's about the ideology. Meaning, in simple words, that if a Muslim is doing a Hitler greeting, then it's counted in the 90% and not in the other percent, right? For example. So this is something which the statistics have been criticized a lot. So, but I think it's important to discuss them. They have also led to this increase, I would say. And the another aspect, I don't know if we discussed it too, it could be, it was mentioned yesterday, maybe Yeshua said it, that it's about the conflict itself that actually changed the discussion and the debate, and the debate on definitions on anti-Semitism also, because I would say the debate about IRA or JDA and all these discussions is actually just about Zionism and anti-Zionism. It's nothing else. I think you mentioned it yesterday that the definition of anti-Semitism is exactly the same, and there is actually no consensus, like no dissent on that. It's only about the question, the conflict here, and question of Zionism. And I think this is related to the actual situation here, which is, I think someone said the occupation, we thought it's temporary, but then we found out it's not. So there is a big frustration about the real situation here, and what's the solution once they too say the peace process had come to a stop, you could say, and this has led to a lot of frustration I mentioned, but also discussions actually in Germany especially of how to deal with anti-Israel or anti-Zionist not only attacks, but also the debates and articles and everything which is mentioned, talking about the debate on the writings of Achille Mbembe. I think there was something which was which was like in Germany it was a different situation, of course, because it was about this. This incident happened. He was not actually. He was invited to hold a lecture, an opening lecture, but since COVID, the event wasn't held. So the debate just going on, not about should he be invited or not, because he was criticized for his writings on Israel. But we had a very long discussion on is it anti-Semitic or not what he's writing, but it is anti-Zionist and all these things. So all these issues have been led to this controversial debate we're having now. Yeah.
Thank you. Moshe.
So you ask why it has become so controversial at the moment. As a historian, I always start with the older history. The concept was controversial from the start. The guy who invented it, I mentioned him already, had an idea. He said, well, the old Jew hatred, Judenfeindschaft, is a concept which should be put aside because we are living in modern times. I'm thinking about the Jews as a race, and directing my hate at Jews because of their race means that I have to use another concept, which is Semites. So I am an anti-Semite. When he started with the first anti-Semitic organization, which was called Antisemitenliga, the League of the Anti-Semites, he found a collaborator who explained the audience what anti-Semitism is all about. And he said more or less as follows. Well, with anti-Semitism I mean that there are good Jews and bad Jews. Those who are cooperating with us are good Jews, so this is one aspect of my anti-Semitism. And on the other hand, those Christians who forget about Christianity are bad Christians, and this is why they can't be anti-Semites. So already from the start, it was a very confusing concept of what really anti-Semitism is. And this goes on not only for the last 140 years, but but for even longer, from the days when we still called it Jew hatred and not anti-Semitism. The second layer now is, of course, or the answer is, it is because it is more relevant today than before. It is more relevant thanks to the Holocaust, because we are dealing all the time with the question of the Holocaust, what was the origin, the actual origin of the Holocaust, anti-Semitism as an explanation, as a root of the Holocaust, has become a matter that should be discussed in societies in which we live today. So without the Holocaust, the discussion about anti-Semitism wouldn't have been as heated as it is. But there is a third layer. It is relevant not only because of the Holocaust, but also because of the use of the Holocaust in the collective memories, especially in those societies I'm dealing with. The Israeli society on the one hand and the German society on the other hand. The memory of the Holocaust, which brings about dealing with the memory of anti-Semitism and with anti-Semitism as it is, brings about instrumentalization of the concept of anti-Semitism. It is an instrument in our fight against something or for something. And this is why it is so acute at the moment. If somebody is accused of being an anti-Semite, especially in Germany, then of course he is außen vor. He is somewhere where he shouldn't be. So this instrument is used especially by those who may make a good use of it. And there we are in one element which was already discussed here today and yesterday, the role of Israel in the discussion about anti-Semitism. For Israel, it is a very important thing to conflate or to identify anti-Semitism with anti-Israel statements or anti-Israeli or anti-Zionist ideas. And this is why this is so controversial at the moment. I mentioned already the resolution passed by the German Bundestag 3 years ago. This is a good example. You want to introduce something into the political arena, you introduce it via the term anti-Semitism, and you're very successful. The Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs was very successful in introducing the discussion about anti-Semitism into German society. And the terrible outcome is something that we have to deal with all the time.
Thanks, Moshe.
So, thanks. So, perhaps I would just, maybe this is, I don't know, a superfluous statement, but Israel doesn't exist because the Holocaust happened. In fact, I would argue that had Israel existed, the Holocaust couldn't have happened. So I think that that's something that both German society and Israeli society have to sort of grapple with, that statement. Zionism, of course.
Try our best to explain it the other way around.
Yeah, so that's why I say it, you know, taking responsibility for our own society. I can't take responsibility for German society, and I do believe that as I have agency and must take responsibility, so must the German coping with whatever renditions of both anti-Semitism, but general Islamophobia, of course, and racism. That is the responsibility of Germany, and I expect the same to be afforded the same agency and sense of responsibility as Germany would, as Israel. And I would say that that's our work. When I talk about the role of Israel as a nation state to which an indigenous people returned, and Zionism, of course, preceded the Holocaust. We all understand that 120 years ago, actually, you can go down the street to the Herzl Museum and see the manuscript of Altneuland. It was written long before the Holocaust occurred. And the understanding that actually, and I appreciate the way that you've helped me think of, reflect on Jew hatred being called, or let's say morphing into or mutating into what was called anti-Semitism, and what we see today as new forms of anti-Semitism, which campus students certainly experience regularly. I think that the importance of understanding that the mutation of anti-Semitism as an ancient hatred from which we can not only learn but address the current forms so that we can actually uphold the commitment to never again, not only against Jews, right? In a world of again and again, you just have to open the news to understand that we have failed colossally as societies to ensure that never again we are all committed to. And never again is a prospective statement. It is not a past-looking statement. Never again in the future. It relies on never again genocide, never again crimes against humanity, never again the terminology that we understand was so grave that words that existed pre-World War II didn't encapsulate what happened to the Holocaust. That is true. But Israel does not exist because the Holocaust happened. And I just want to also turn to the importance of definitions. And actually, you made me think of, I was a commissioner for the prevention of sexual harassment at a prominent university in Israel for 5 years. And one of my colleagues, actually from Sachin, once said to me, all of my male professor colleagues say to me all the time, until you became commissioner, there was no sexual harassment at our university. That was her line. So, I reflected on it as you were talking about, the tracking of anti-Semitism. So now that we're tracking anti-Semitism, it turns out that there's a lot of anti-Semitism is a problematic sort of understanding of if we acknowledge that the importance of definitions, and especially, and maybe that brings us a little bit to the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism or JDA, whatever it is that I know there are different preferences in this room, or maybe not so many for the IRA. The importance of understanding that there is a definition that is an educational resource. It was always intended to be a resource. It was very important as a 15-year democratic process with academicians sitting around the table for those 15 years and coming to a consensus definition after those 15 years, that it remain a resource and not a legally binding definition. And one of the reasons that it's important to define is if you don't define, you can't identify, and you can't address, and you can't combat, assuming you think anti-Semitism is a problem. So I just would, just to close this piece, I would say that understanding in historical perspective the mutation of anti-Semitism, and now we can decide that it's mutation from, targeting of the Jew for religious reasons to targeting of the Jew on grounds of race, although Whoopi Goldberg probably disagrees, to targeting of the Jew in another form. We don't have to agree that it is the nation state that we're now targeting, but perhaps it is part of the mutation that we have to address. It is the very understanding of the 3Ds, at least as I understand it, in the resource that the IRA provides. It's also where the Jerusalem Declaration and the IRA sort of diverge most extensively. I understand that neither may be a good exercise as far as some people are concerned, but assuming that you think that the exercise of defining is important in order to identify and combat, then those 3Ds, the demonization, the delegitimization, and the double standards, and I focus on the double standards because they're by far the most elusive. That double standard piece, to me, again, and I go back to just basic Law 101, I'm just a simple lawyer, those double standards actually ensure the equal and consistent application of any rules, of any understandings that we have, of any moral principles, and I believe that as a resource are an important part of the IRA working definition if we are to use it for educational purposes, not for censorship or free speech, but actually in order to identify double standards as something that we value the understanding and the importance of, or rather not having singling out of one member state in this case or one individual in other cases in order to address the possible mutation of an ancient hatred that has received many mutations and permeations over history.
So may I ask, why is it more controversial now than it was 10 years, 20 years ago?
Yeah, so I think you answered, those 3 layers of why it's more controversial, and certainly the existence of the State of Israel as the exercise and the political exercise or the national liberation or the success of the national liberation movement of the Jews, which is what Zionism was. It was a progressive national liberation movement 120 years ago. I mean, you know, and its success is probably its downfall in that the state of Israel exists. But that's a little bit like, you know, blaming the victim. So because Israel exists, we're saying because Israel exists, then it's contentious to define anti-Semitism.
Just virtual history. An example, what would have happened to anti-Semitism after 45 if Israel were not created? This is something to think about. And if we judge by the, let's say, the attitude of anti-Semites after 45, I think the right answer to the question is, without Israel, we would have had less anti-Semitism, at least. That's
an interesting conclusion. It's considering 6 million people were murdered. That's a very interesting conclusion, but okay. An interesting conclusion. I mean, I just don't know how you reach it. But.
Seth?
I mean, I just, maybe to take it for a moment, do you want to?
I was trying to say Seth or Saba-Nur. Would you like to intervene?
No. I would not get into this now.
In that case,
you want to say something on that?
No, if Seth wants to continue on this, that would be helpful. No, okay.
I don't I get the idea of it, but it's in a question which maybe does not lead us further in that discussion.
Oh, it leads us very much further.
Oh, well, you're a historian.
You're asking this. I'm a historian. I know where it
exactly. Yeah, but it's something we cannot really discuss. I mean, we have like the state of Israel. Yeah, but we won't get to a point which makes, which helps us maybe to find out why is it so controversial. Maybe totally another point which is important for my field, because we're looking at the field, and I'm coming from there, as I said, from the educational context, and we actually didn't discuss it yet, is the role of social media, which changed so much in Germany, talking about what happened, or what wasn't, what happened to anti-Semitism, or how has anti-Semitism been expressed 20 years before and now. So I started working when I was very young, which is almost like it's 25 years ago, almost, in civic education. And I remember the talks I had with students and with teachers were totally different than I'm having now. And now I have these young students sitting in front of me and showing me their videos about what's happening in Gaza, what's happening in Israel, that people are being shot because they're like doing nothing, and innocent people are killed over and over, and all these things, and always trying to explain to me, we're not talking about Jews, we're just talking about Zionists. They always try to make this distinction. Our problem is not that the Jews, of course, that's fine, we're very tolerant towards other religions, and but it's about the state of Israel, and it's about Zionism, and which is I think very important if we talk about the change and why it's becoming so controversial. Talking about the BDS resolution, for example, which changed the discourse in Germany totally. This is one very important aspect. And it goes back to a lot of discussions on Twitter, which may sound so simple, but it's actually where it comes from. We had one debate, I'll just mention one, about an exhibition of an Israeli student in Berlin. The exhibition was called, that had the title Unlearning Zionism, and it had a state funding, and because of some very little, like a lot of people, but because of a lot of some people who criticized it in social media, this exhibition could still go on, but the funding stopped because of the resolution, because of the BDS resolution, which is totally not binding because we had it before. It's important to say, and it's from the last Bundestag. It's not from the present one, so we don't know what will happen to that resolution in the next 4 years. But it's still not officially, that they didn't state, they didn't say anything about that yet. So. So what is happening is that this piece of this resolution is being misused, and in a lot, and it goes back to a lot of different, like we have two camps, you could say, and who express their views very in a very dominant way in social media, and where you can see that there's different definitions, you could say, and controversial debates. I mentioned the debate about Mbembe and everything, where there people are really discussing it and putting a lot of, I would say, pressure on government also, which leads to, for example, this resolution and other issues. So just the role of social media, I would say, is quite important. I started actually with the young students, because, just last point on that, because that's what I am actually working in the field, discussing with students what are they looking, how they are looking at this conflict, what ideas of Jews and Zionism or Zionist ideas they're getting there. And it depends. If you're a Muslim, you have a totally different timeline on Instagram than if you're a Jew. And this is because I work with Jewish and Muslim groups, we just simply compared it, and it's so different. Just talking about the last escalation in May 2021, was it 2021? And I just realized that it's very, very important to actually talk about these realities, online realities, and they make a lot of difference.
Before you go, Seth, I'll point out, I think, that in response to the questions that I put at the start, there's been a lot of attention to why anti-Semitism is controversial. And I think, broadly speaking, although there are disagreements, I think we actually agree about the area that is producing the controversy. But there's been remarkably little discussion, which is interesting, about actually the state of anti-Semitism. In some ways, these sorts of issues, the sorts of experiences of Jewish people in the diaspora that Seth started talking about at the very start of our session. And I think that is an interesting absence. I think it's an absence which reflects on those recorded anti-Semitic incidents whether in Germany or in Britain, which actually have nothing to do with Israel and anti-Zionism, and often, I mean, some have right-wing motivations, others are Moshe hooliganism. I mean, there's an awful lot of the reporting of the assaults on visibly Orthodox Jews in the UK would fall into that category. So I suppose, abusing my position as chair, I'll simply say that one of the interesting things about this debate is that the focus on the connections or disconnections between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism actually take attention away from some of the daily experiences of Jews in the diaspora. But having abused my position, I'll let Seth speak.
Well, it connects with this point, but it goes back somewhat to the earlier conversation, which is we don't have to ask the counterfactual. We can talk about the conjunctural moment in which we find ourselves. This is a story also about power and powerlessness in Jewish history. And so why this issue has become controversial, or why it has become the focus of greater attention, is because we're living in a time and a place where the realities of what is happening here in Israel and Palestine have transformed questions of Jewishness. I mean, Yeshayahu Leibovitz talked about the conflation of Judaism and nationalism, and what the nationalization of Judaism would do, and here we are at the teleological endpoint of that collapse. Now, it doesn't mean at the same time that we can't also talk about the experience of Jews, how they contend with anti-Semitism in the different locales in which they find themselves, and I think that's absolutely perceptive to David to ask why we aren't talking about that. Is also, I think, then where the question of the definition comes in, because it's in the moment of the imposition of definitions that we find ourselves here sitting at this table having this conference. And one has to wonder why that's happening now and why we are in this space. And I want to go back, Michal, to something you said, which is the question of, oh, these definitions are meant to be educative. You know, you join an institution as an officer looking at sexual harassment, you bring definitions to the table, and we can now name and define sexual harassment. Were it only so in the case of anti-Semitism that these definitions were serving educative purposes alone or helping in that process? What I have seen and experienced in my own institution, but from colleagues in the UK and the US, is a way in which that educative purpose stated initially for the use of these definitions has become de facto legal or de facto politicized. We wouldn't be sitting here and having this conversation if we didn't have colleagues like mine at UCL being accused of hidden anti-Semitism for displaying a Palestinian flag, or on Nakba Day in Germany, Palestinian activists being detained, or in the context of an area not far from me in London of Tower Hamlets, where a bike ride for Gaza is being canceled on the basis of these kinds of discussions and definitions. So we are in this conjunctural moment because of the introduction of the definitions and the way that they have been used. It might be interesting, maybe not here and maybe not in this session, because I know we have some of the drafters of various definitions in the room, to think about the gap between perhaps the benign or positive intentions of drafters and the abuses that actually have exploded in everyday life, where we're sitting here and having these conversations because of some of the ways in which this has morphed into something it was not intended to be. So I think that might answer somewhat, I think, David, your question.
I just wanted to, I mean, maybe I'm the only one that hears it, but I keep hearing the importance of actually having the IRA include the 3Ds, because if you exclude the demonization, delegitimization, and double standards towards Israel, by definition, you've actually taken out what enables Jews to be targeted, as you mentioned, just because they're visibly Jewish. So if that isn't something that troubles everybody, and I think it should actually, that because there is a war in Israel, visibly Jewish individuals are accosted on the streets of New York, Berlin, Toronto, or anywhere else in the world, as we know from just a year ago, then indeed that is the importance of including the 3Ds in that mutation of anti-Semitism. And actually, just to respond, I think that the using, or the importance of using a resource as an educational resource, but also as a tool, for example, in the online space, and you mentioned how difficult it is to interact with the younger generation without at least taking into account the reality in which, actually, if anybody hasn't seen the movie Social Dilemma, it's actually recommended for parents to watch it with your children, to understand actually this world that our own children are experiencing as almost siloed individual islands in which we are consuming information. I think that not taking into account the social media piece, we would be remiss. But in fact, it's those very social media companies that need definitions in order to be able to create algorithmic adjustments, because they're using algorithms in order, without any transparency, by the way, in order to define what is and what isn't allowed on their spaces. Obviously, first and foremost, transparency is imperative, and actually the Interparliamentary Task Force to Combat Online Anti-Semitism asked Twitter and Facebook and you know, all of TikTok, and TikTok is a very troubling one actually, because the younger audiences are on TikTok, where there is zero transparency in how it is that the algorithm, and it's just a business model, right? It's the business model, which is what Social Dilemma is essentially about. But in order to be able to even begin to tackle that transparency, they've got to have definitions, right? If pornography isn't allowed, and there is a definition of pornography, other, you know, whatever it is that we don't want on those spaces, or that we do want on those spaces, with an educational resource that says you are engaging in Holocaust denial if you are what's called point of view, engaging in, well, it's called Holocaust porn on TikTok. You're engaging in Holocaust denial, you're telling a 16-year-old they're engaging in Holocaust denial, they don't know what the Holocaust was. And so there are real educational mechanisms that could be utilized, so long as we have a definition. And then we go back to the question of, why do we need a definition? Well, here are some examples of why we need a definition. Now we can talk about what should be done with those definitions and which definition it should be. And of course, there's sort of an inherent contradiction in terms, because if I said that in the case of anti-Semitism and many other, such concepts, over time there is a mutation and a change in what it means. Then how do we define it? And we define it for now, and now is it anchored, now forever is that? And I think that that's why it was important to, I'll say again, and sadly we haven't heard from those that sat around those tables of the IRA to actually specifically say it is not a legally binding definition, specifically utilize it as a resource so that it enables a wider margin of understanding that it is only encapsulating what this current rendition of anti-Semitism looks like, including the examples and not just what's in the neat little box. But that's just from my perspective.
But who decides? I mean, who decides on how to define?
In the case of IRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance and 15 years of democratic process decided, right? That we can talk, now we can talk about who decides and who decided JDA and who, but in the case of IRA, I know, just to say that there was a 15-year democratic process that reached a consensus definition then adopted by 37 countries and hundreds of entities. So we can undermine the democratic process. In an academic setting, I find that troubling, but we can say we don't accept that definition. Here's another one, we've come up with it, it's called the JDA. Or we could say we don't accept any definition or a need for a definition. That would be okay too, but yeah, but that's a different discussion than the one.
But if I don't accept the definition, or I don't accept the intellectual premise or the political implications, and I invite, I don't know, Ayman Odeh to come to UCL and to talk about how he thinks the nation-state law is racist and that Israel's an apartheid state, am I suddenly going to have to find myself filling out
in Israel's Knesset? You don't have to worry.
Sure, but is he going to have a harder time coming to London to talk to my students about that? Well, you're shaking your head no, but I'm telling you from the experience of having watched the abuses of the way that it has been used, that it's not a theoretical conversation. It's actually a reality that I don't have to talk about Germany. I'm not the one who's the expert on the German context. We're not living in a vacuum. There is an intention and there's a reality. And so how we account for the reality, I think, needs to be responded to.
I mean, I'd be remiss if I didn't say I think that Zionist professors and students feel that very same sort of delegitimization that you're, sort of attributing to Ayman Odeh. I don't know that he's been disinvited from many universities, but I know that many Zionist students can't attend programs if they actually self-profess to be Zionist, and I know that outing yourself as a Jew today on campuses is something that students actually are back to the language of the 60s. Do I out myself as a Jew on this campus? So those are just the stats, speaking of numbers.
Okay, I think we are basically to the question whether we need a definition or not. That's what your plaidoyer. Your answer was, maybe we need a definition, but who decides which definition is better? The IRA definition is no definition, basically. The basic problem is the examples IRA uses in order to help define what anti-Semitism is and what it is not. And there, of course, there is a controversy, because not everybody will agree that these were the ideal examples of what anti-Semitism is about. And now I return to what seems to be a bit paradox, this this kind of virtual history about what would have happened without Israel. The German parliament set or created a committee to deal with the question of how much anti-Semitism there is in Germany, what it is in Germany, and they found out, and there we are with numbers. And the numbers are about 5% of the Germans may be considered as anti-Semites on the basis of the classical definition of anti-Semitism. Only 5%, which is a real progress, compared to, let's say, 20% 30 years ago and 50% 70 years ago. Now, there is another kind of anti-Semitism, another definition, which is the secondary anti-Semitism, which is denying the Holocaust or relativizing the Holocaust. There you have about 28%. That is, this kind of anti-Semitism, which is new and newly defined, is more present in German society than the old good anti-Semitism. And now the third kind of anti-Semitism, which is the Israel-related anti-Semitism, Israel-bezogener Antisemitismus, about 40%, which means without Israel, we have at the most only 28% anti-Semitism.
So we'll cancel Israel and problem solved.
The question is why the presence of Israel is becoming relevant to the attitude towards anti-Semitism. I do not argue that they have to legitimize the state of Israel or create something instead of the state of Israel. It is the role Israel plays in this mechanism of creating an attitude towards anti-Semitism. Israel is manipulating it willingly in order to get support for its criminal policy in the Middle East, in the West Bank.
That's really important because actually all I've heard since yesterday is why this has nothing to do with 1967. It's everything to do with 1948. So you're saying Israel's criminalizing, but that's 1967.
I'm not trying to talk about Mapai versus
No,
Likud.
but 1948, the very existence of a state of Israel. That's what you're talking about. The very existence, not 1967. It's not about West Bank or not West Bank. If I understand correctly, I just want to make sure I understand.
I'm trying to answer the question of our chairman, why is it more virulent now than before? We are now living with a totally different government in Israel, a totally different approach, and this might be an explanation why the topic Israel is more relevant, or has become more relevant to the discussion about anti-Semitism in general, and why anti-Semitism is more conspicuous now than it used to be before, which puts I think, a real responsibility on the Israeli politics to rethink their way, their attitude to the whole question of anti-Semitism and its own policy.
Before opening it up, I'll open it up in just a moment. I'll ask Seth and Saba-Nur if they want to have any last a word on this issue, or maybe when we were talking about the
relationship between
on the educative versus the sort of disciplinary impact of definitions, if you wanted to speak about that from your experience in Germany or anything else before we turn it out.
You don't want to talk about that. Talking about the distinction between, or the definition, you said, the definition of anti-Semitism, the debate, it is reflected in the educational context, but very less, because the question is why, and why should we use these two political definitions, right? It's, I mean, you can find several hundreds of definitions on anti-Semitism, even before the IRA definition, of course, everyone knows that. So it's not something that it is, to make it very short, it's not very helpful in educational settings. And why, like there was a need for a coordinated institutional response to hate crimes. I think that's why we had IRA, or that's why we had a definition. That's what I remember, that for data classification, that police needed it, but like not talking about the education, civic education, where you cannot, we don't work with the definitions and we don't argue between those two, because that's another question. That's then, a seminar on anti-Semitism is one thing, and a seminar on the Palestine-Israel conflict is another. So that's what we differentiate, and then I think that also says a lot about how useful the different definitions are. Maybe just one aspect, one case which is discussed quite a lot of times, and I would be interested in your view on that as well. But like there was a ruling in Germany, I guess a lot of people know that too, that it was in 2014 when a German ruling said that firebombing a synagogue is not anti-Semitic, because 3 Palestinian attacked a synagogue in 2014, that was, I think, and the men insisted that they didn't want to hurt anyone or anything. It was just their expression of criticism on Israel. And this was actually, I was thinking about that case in the panel before, that we could talk on that as well. But this makes clear why we need a definition in specific areas, but maybe not in educational field, where it's more about learning prejudice, learning about how different groups live with each other and in a heterogeneous society, all these issues, to make it short.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Maybe just, I want to add here something that has some bearing also on the question of how this links with broader struggles and broader questions of identity. I mean, my sense, and I see this in the UK, and David, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that the battle over the definition has become totemic. And it's become the hill that certainly Anglo-Jews, many groups within the Anglo-Jewish community who have engaged in this debate, but also political parties and also non-governmental organizations, it's kind of the hill that everybody's happy to die on whether you adopt a certain definition or not. And I worry about how this impoverishes one sense of Jewish identity, that we've hitched a sort of question of Jewish communal life to definitions of anti-Semitism. What has that done to bonds of solidarity with non-Jewish communities? I certainly see in the UK an erosion. I had this conversation with students of mine at UCL. If the Jewish Society makes a campaign for adoption of the IRA, its banner, and it alienates Palestinians and Muslims and Christians who feel that this is affecting them negatively, what has that done to their ability to engage across communal spaces? And what does it mean then for the natural question of, well, does every group get a definition? And are we in the definition Olympics? And how does that affect anti-racist struggle and politics of solidarity? So I think there are bigger questions here at stake. And also the final thing I want to say is how are Jews being used in this? How are Jewish communities being used in this debate? Who is it serving? It's really striking to me, as you can hear from my accent as an American living in the UK, to watch the debate over these issues unfold, and certainly within the context of the Jewish community and the Tory party, how the Tory party has used the Jewish community and used these discussions and debates to kind of elevate and demonstrate and genuflect about its symbolic love and support for the Jewish community through policies like adoption of IRA and necessitating its adoption at universities and the Arsenal Football Club and elsewhere. And I asked myself, what's the implication of hitching your wagon to those politics? Do you really want Priti Patel to be your friend? This is a minister who is, advocating for migrants to be sent to Rwanda. This is a government, it's a nasty government, and it's doing nasty things. And so I think communities, in the case I'm talking about the UK, but I think we could ask ourselves about that in France, other parts of Europe, and the US. Certainly we haven't talked about the US, but who are the people who are defending or using Jewish communal interests as a kind of political hot potato? And do you want to find yourself on the receiving end of their love? And I think that's a question we need to be asking ourselves as well.
Thank you, Seth, for opening it up in that way.
Only one sentence in addition. I think the same question has to be put also within the framework of German society and the Jewish community in German society. The alliance between the AfD, between the neo-Nazis sitting in Germany, and some elements in the Jewish community is something which is really worrying.
Thank you, Moshe. I can see six people, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Please make your questions and interventions as brief as possible, and please wait for the mic.
So important. It's working? Yeah. If it's so important to adopt definition in order to fight against anti-Semitism, why is it not important to adopt definition against anti-black racism and other forms of racism? Is it that anti-Semitism is so much worse than other forms of racism in the UK or Germany?
Yes, this question to Michal. Speaking about delegitimizing Israel, so is the problem that you don't think that any country under any circumstances could be delegitimized? So the question put another way, is there the threshold where Israel and its treatment of the Palestinian, it would be okay to legitimize Israel? And what is that threshold?
Responding to what David said about anti-Semitism in the current context, and I'll speak about the Americas, which is the context I know, so leaving aside Europe, anti-Semitism is rising throughout the Americas, and this has nothing to do with Israel, almost nothing. It has to do with economic scarcity, has to do with populist politics, climate collapse, pandemic, and Jews as a convenient scapegoat, not the only scapegoat, also Asians. Anti-black violence is increasing, anti-Latino violence is increasing. This is a time of growing right-wing populism that is largely positioning itself as friendly to Israel. And I just want to reiterate, Israel is not the driving force of anti-Semitism in the West, you know, in any way, shape, or form, in my own opinion.
Thank you. A question for Professor Zimmermann. As a historian, don't you think that the rise of radical Islam in the world has played a part in anti-Semitic incidents? And I'm thinking of France in particular. Think of 2012, for instance, and Toulouse.
Yeah, I also just want to raise something. I mean, Moshe Zimmermann, you also mentioned that that it's the establishment of Israel that it kind of, had it not been for Israel, anti-Semitism would maybe decline. And I beg to defer, because maybe it would have just increased. So if the European Jews, the ones that, you know, survived, would have stayed, not have gone to the Americas and not have gone to Israel, would have literally stayed in Europe, I'm not so sure anti-Semitism would have been declining. On the contrary. And we see that in Poland, right? Like with the several Polish Jews that did go back home and were murdered in Poland. And not that it really matters, because I think it's kind of like, what if, like, what if Ben-Gurion would have signed this or that? Like, really, who cares? And also this is going back to something that you raised with the majority of Jews in Europe who do identify with Israel, and that's on an increase, right? We see that, and I think Sergio, your paper shows that, that I think, what was it, like almost 90%, yeah, but like there is a certain increase with Jewish people in Europe identifying with Israel more and more as well, and that's something that needs to be addressed too, right?
You call it the Stockholm syndrome.
No, just hold on, Moshe. Could you pass it behind you, please?
Jews weren't Jews, there wouldn't be any anti-Semitism.
My comment is on David. You jumped from Great Britain to Germany as if in between there was no France.
It was just my dream.
You are right to do that, because half of the Jews of Europe live in France.
Yeah.
There are 600,000 Jews in France.
Absolutely.
No, I don't want to enter in the little examples of a student in Toronto that doesn't feel good because of Shabbat and things like that. I want just to be tachlis, to be concrete, okay? From now 20 years, 80,000 Jews fled from France to Israel. And more than 150,000 Jews left their suburbs and their cities to settle in another place in France or elsewhere. So you might have hooligans, all kind of little problems. This is a massive thing. Sociologists are interested in migrants, displaced people, but they are not interested in this phenomena, okay? I would like you British sociologists to have a look at what is happening there. Okay?
Could you please also, you spoke about the practice of anti-Semitism. Could you please talk about the causal relations between anti-Semitism practices which are happening today and between the violation of human rights of the Palestinians? I mean, it seems like an elephant that is not being considered here. And thank you.
Thank you. And I'll just add one further question which has come through the ether from Niv, who says, is it even possible to use the 3Ds method when talking about Palestinians? Can you blame them for having a double standard because the issue of Israel is much closer to them than other states? And then continuing, can Americans be blamed for having a double standard, criticizing Israel rather than, say, Myanmar, since Israel is a very close ally of the American regime? That's obviously picking up your point, Michal, about the 3Ds. So I'll just ask people, there's plenty to respond to. Moshe, why don't we start with you and work around the table?
Okay, first of all, the question about definition. As a historian, the answer is always, we always need definitions. And this is what historians do, try to provide us with definition. What racism is, what anti-Semitism is, what radicalism is, and so on and so forth. So there is no special treatment when it comes to anti-Semitism, or there shouldn't be any special treatment. And if there is a special treatment, this is of course some kind of a double standard in research or in politics, I don't know. Now there were two questions that were directed at me. The first one, what about the role of Muslims in...
Radical Islam.
Radical Islam, not Muslims.
Okay. So the question of radical Islam and its role in the dissemination of anti-Semitism. Radical Islam is a part of or is one aspect of Islam in general. Radical Islam is using anti-Semitic propaganda for its cause. The question is the question of effectivity, or the effect of this kind of anti-Semitism. Historically, Islam, Muslims, were not to be compared with Christianity and Christians when it comes to Jew hatred or anti-Semitism. And the golden age of Jewish existence in the diaspora was a golden age under Islam. So it's not Islam, it's maybe radical Islam in a specific situation at the moment where the state of Israel is leading a kind of a policy which invites all kinds of reactions, including the reaction of radical Islam. So far, so good. The problem is usually when it comes to Israel's manipulation of this instrument of anti-Semitism, that the sense of proportion is fading away. The impression is created as if radical Islam is the main element of dispersing or making propaganda for anti-Semitism at the moment. I am speaking not about France at the moment, I'm speaking about Germany. In Germany, recent research shows that it's not radical Islam that is more effective in disseminating anti-Semitism compared to right-wing extremism in Germany or right-wing radicalism in Germany. So nobody is going to deny that radical Islam or radical Muslims are using elements of anti-Semitism, which is relatively new or at least more effective than it used to be in the past. But first of all, it wouldn't have happened if the the enemy to fight against were not Israel, and secondly, without the use or the manipulation or the instrumentalization of this kind of anti-Semitism in Israeli propaganda, which has very clear political aims, mainly in the last 15, 20 years, at least since the Ministry of Strategic Affairs started with the work. The other question that was posed here, your question, I saw your reaction when I said what I tried to say in the beginning. My argument is, if according to the findings of the commission set by the German Bundestag, is that only 5% of what we used to call anti-Semitism, or 5% of the German population, is open to this kind of anti-Semitism, compared to 40% who think about anti-Semitism concentrating on Israel, the answer is clear-cut. Without Israel as a theme, I'm talking about thematisieren. Wenn Israel nicht thematisiert wird,
it's more legitimate.
there is nothing new about it at the moment. Zionism exists since the year 1897. Israel exists since 1948. The rise in this anti-Israel or Israel-bezogener Antisemitismus, what you call Israel-bezogener Antisemitismus, Israel-related antisemitism, this rise is a product of the conflict as it developed, especially in the last years. And it is a product of the way Israel is dealing with this conflict in the last years. Otherwise, this kind of reaction would have been the reaction already in the year 52 or 55 or 60. Times change, and they change not because Israel exists, this is not the explanation, because Israel does what it does in the West Bank, in the Middle East, or because what it does when it comes to framing the question of what Israel does in the conflict in the Middle East. This is, I think, the correlation that we have to refer to.
Michal.
Thanks. So actually, maybe I'll just continue from where Moshe ended, it's amazing because in some ways, basically, you're reiterating the same claim. Anti-Semitism wouldn't exist if there were no Jews, and anti-Zionism wouldn't exist if there was no Israel. And all I hear is the understanding of the importance of the 3 Ds and the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism as the single most important resource that actually addresses that mutation and enables us to identify exactly what murdered Sarah Halimi in France as Jewish kindergarten teacher.
I have to make one thing very clear. I didn't say that anti-Semitism is created by
existence
Israel,
of Jews.
Israeli policy. It is a question of effectiveness or popularity of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism was in Germany very popular during the Third Reich. It lost in popularity.
And now it's popular because of Israel.
5% only, according to the report of the Bundestag,
that form,
are anti-Semites on the basis of what used to be
Yeah,
anti-Semitic?
I understand. No, I'm thrilled I understand, because it actually highlights the imperative of tracking the mutation of anti-Semitism, understanding it to its core, and actually identifying that 1948, when the war was waged on the very return of an indigenous people to its ancestral homeland, namely Israel, from that moment of war after war after war, right until 1967, from 1948 to 1967, with Israel attempting to create a coexisting reality with some other state at its side, called Palestine or called whatever it will be called in the future, should it exist, actually like almost a racism of like low expectations that radical Islam has to speak that language that says Israel cannot exist, and the understanding that in order to weaponize international law, after the 3 no's of Khartoum, 1967, no to recognition of Israel, no to negotiation with Israel, no to peace. Just one second, I'm just in the middle. I'm just in the middle. Sorry, I'm just, no. Sorry, I was invited to speak on a panel, and nobody disturbed anybody else. So actually, just to make the point, I don't think Ayman Oda would be disturbed if he was speaking here, and I am being disturbed. And I was invited to speak as a panelist. So I am sharing the understanding that in 1967, the 3 no's of Khartoum, I didn't invent them, actually negated the right to recognize the state of Israel, to create any negotiation, and certainly to have peace with Israel. And actually, I would go straight to 2020 and say that the Abraham Accords are the potential paradigm shift that all peoples of the region stand a chance, including Palestinians, yes, to be freed, but from Hamas, from a genocidal terror organization that has adopted the demonization, delegitimization, and double standards against the state of Israel, weaponizing international law, so that we should all be concerned. And in the Zionism as Racism of 1975, though it was rescinded in the 2001 rendition of Israel as an apartheid state, we are stripping the possibility of peace and coexistence for the Palestinians to coexist alongside in Israel. If there is no right of any country to exist, then I suppose there is no right of Palestine to exist or Israel to exist and the United States to exist. But assuming we accept that there is a legitimacy of political organization of all others, then I would think we would be remiss to deny only Jews the single, country that's been created to be exactly what it was formed to be, according to the Declaration of Independence. We discussed here if David Ben-Gurion would like the IRA, I would like the Jerusalem Declaration. I would argue that the Declaration of Independence speaks very clearly into the indigeneity of Jews returning to Israel as an ancestral homeland, into the existence of Israel as a nation state of the Jewish people, and into its complete commitment to equality for all of its citizens as the single Jew among the nations. And that's where double standards become very, very important, in the understanding that Israel, at the very least, has the very right that every other country has to exist. So to answer the question about the legitimacy or the delegitimization, that doesn't preclude, and by the way, the IRA stipulates very clearly, the right to criticize Israel, as any other country is criticized. And I don't hear, or I actually did hear in a presentation here, the legitimacy of any country to exist. But barring that, if we delegitimize any countries from existing, that's a whole other conversation. We can have it another day. But assuming that countries have the right to exist and that people accept countries' right to exist, then you can criticize but not delegitimize its very right to exist as the single Jewish and democratic country in existence. And that's the difference. Yeah, democratic according to the principles of the Declaration of Independence, indeed as the single Jewish and democratic country. And there are Christian and democratic countries, and there are Muslim and non-democratic countries. And they have equal, according to the Declaration of Independence, the notion of equality, and the word equality appears 9 times. I don't have to educate, there are historians in the room, 9 times in the Declaration of Independence. So the question is, and I'm glad we're having this conversation, because it's really clear that it's about 1948. Does Israel have a right to exist? Then we can jump over to 1967 and in what ways and in what borders. But we're not there in this conversation, in this room. We are at the conversation of, does Israel even have a right to exist? And there are those of us that believe it doesn't, and that's okay, and I respect your opinion, but I expect you to, at least afford me the same respect. I do believe that Israel has a right to exist as the nation state of the Jewish people.
Can I come in here? The problem the problem with this is it's sophistry. This is not an actual conversation that's based on any developments of historical importance or value. It passes over all the critical historiography that would refute lots of these assertions. So it certainly wouldn't pass muster in my classroom, but it certainly, I think, is emblematic.
Zionists wouldn't pass muster in your classroom.
That's not true. That's not true. I have many Zionist and Jewish students in my classroom who are very comfortable to express themselves. But I think what you've suggested here is actually emblematic of the framing of this conversation at the state level in the city that we're sitting. The very fact that this conversation has played out this way is, to me, representative of a kind of paltry lack of understanding of the actual experience of how various Jewish communities are contending with anti-Semitism. I think the point about France is extremely well made, which is we cannot, or we are distracted from talking about realities of what Jewish communities are facing because we're sitting and having sophistry about definitions and about how the state has been using this. And that doesn't really serve anyone at a moment of crisis, I think, for questions of diaspora Jewish communities and how they contend with very real dynamics on the ground. One other thing I think to say is, you know, the way in which this discussion plays out, certainly in the question relating to how it affects Palestinians, is to me also one that we need to be asking ourselves is how does the reality here, it doesn't have to be a question of its causality for anti-Semitism. It has to be a question of the correlation, I think, which is what Moshe was suggesting, between the realities of a political explosion in this space with debates over anti-Semitism. How does what we see, for example, at the Flag March, how does anti-Palestinian racism, how does the realities of inequality in this political context, how does that shape lived experience of Palestinians, and how does it shape the reception amongst not only Palestinian but other communities towards questions of state and sovereignty of Israel? And I think the way in which this has become so entangled is that we now are every time there is an issue that flares up here, those of us who live outside of this place have to contend with the consequences and have to contend with the reckless and irresponsible positioning that you're suggesting here that I think motivates some of the political debate.
Thank you, Seth. Saba-Nur, would you like the last word?
Yeah, so about that issue now. So there were some questions actually left. Maybe I'll go to that, back to one of those questions. You were talking about definitions for everything, and I guess this is something which is going to happen. This is the case in Germany, as you could say, because we had the working definition on anti-Semitism. We had just, I think 2 years ago, we had a working definitions on racism against Sinti and Roma, and I'm now part of the Independent Commission on Islamophobia, which is also, we're also working on a definition. I don't know how much that helps, but it's something which is kind of, it's a trend, you could say, but of course we have the difficulties also with that. I think the point made about radical Islam was quite important. We didn't discuss it much, but I couldn't even tell more about the Muslim minority in Germany and the research we have, but actually the lack of research we have in concerning the anti-Semitic attitudes of Muslims, because there is no representative data we have until now, which is also
quite a number of
there's quite a number, but it's
articles. The Antisemitismus-Forschung-Institute.
Of course, but still not represented. It's not enough, and we still don't have a big data or enough data to say how bad it is, as you could say. There is
or the other way around, that it's not as bad as it is usually presented in
That's another discussion you could say, but it's something that I just wanted to. Yeah, well, he already left, but it's something we just didn't discuss at all, and it's quite important to mention that. But maybe since we're just my last comment, I'm missing a Palestinian voice also, right? If we're talking about anti-Semitism in a conference, but actually talking about definitions, and then always talk the whole time talking about the conflict itself and anti-Zionism or Zionism itself, then it might be important to include a Palestinian voice to discuss that.
I think we actually have one.
I think we have to return.
In that panel, maybe also, because we're talking about the field.
Only one sentence about definition. The problem is the flexibility of definitions that we are using. You were talking all the time about the 3 Ds. Those who are considered to be Israel-related anti-Semites usually do not include more than a very small minority of supporters of the 3 Ds. Most of them belong to this group because we are so flexible with the definition itself. We create a huge minority of Israel-related anti-Semitism, which is at the end. From the point of view of a professional Antisemitism forscher, somebody who is dealing with anti-Semitism, not anti-Semitic at all.
Thank you, Moshe. We are out of time. Clearly, we could go on all night, and there might be some people with an appetite for that, but we will not do so. I would like to end by thanking everyone who's joined us in the room, everyone online, especially those who asked questions and interventions, and above all, I'd like to thank our 4 speakers. Thank you very much indeed.